Last lesson, we talked about Lutheranism, a new form of Christianity. But it doesn't stop there. The Protestant Reformation creates many alternatives to Catholic Christianity. Others, besides Luther, contributed ideas that fueled the Reformation. Ulrich Zwingli, a Swiss priest who was influenced by humanism, developed his own reformist theology and became an influential leader. Zwingli began advocating reform very soon after Luther did. Although the two put forth similar concepts, Zwingli claimed that he had come up with his own ideas and had not copied Luther. So let's take a look at Zwingli's reforms. Zwingli opposed church decorations because he felt they might distract people or promote idolatry, worshipping of idols. Consequently, he urged that all decorations and images be removed and that the walls of the churches be whitewashed. He also saw music as a distraction and wanted to eliminate it from church services, even going so far as to have organs smashed. In contrast, Luther loved music and wrote several hymns to be used in church services. Zwingli did not want the churches to retain any of the money they collected. Instead, he insisted that all the money should go to aid the poor. Zwingli rejected the ideas of both the Catholic Church and Luther concerning communion. He did not believe that the elements of communion, bread and wine, became the literal body and blood of Christ, as Catholics did, or that they took on mystical properties, as Luther claimed. Instead, he saw these elements as merely symbolic. In 1519, Zwingli was appointed people's priest of Zurich, Switzerland, the most powerful clerical position in the city, and began to institute reforms. The changes he made and the ideas he preached created a stir among Catholics in Zurich. The city council decided to hold a debate to address the controversy and hear the merits of Zwingli's positions. At the debate, Zwingli defended his ideas. Then Catholic priest argued why he was incorrect and why his ideas should be ignored. The Catholics were not used to defending their ideas, and Zwingli made a number of very persuasive arguments that convinced the city to allow him to preach. Church and government were tied together in Zurich under Zwingli. Since the city council had decreed that his ideas were to be followed, the mingling of church and state occurred. Zwingli held considerable influence over the council, convincing them to implement and enforce his ideas. Catholics were excluded under his theocracy, for the city council did not want both Protestants and Catholics arguing over ideas and creating disharmony in the city. His ideas spread from Zurich into other cantons, prompting conflicts with the forest cantons that were Catholic. Marburg Quoloky. Zwingli feared that the forest provinces would form an alliance against him and launch an attack on Zurich. He hoped to ward this off by creating a similar alliance among Protestant cities, including German ones. Both Luther and Zwingli would have benefited from such an alliance because it would have given both of them a stronger military presence against those who opposed them. Philip of Hesse, a German noble who supported the Reformation, called a conference at Marburg to try to reconcile the differences between the views of Luther and Zwingli and create a unified Protestant theology. The two leaders were able to reach a consensus on almost every issue except communion. In a debate over the nature of communion, Luther argued that the service was more than just a remembrance of the act of Christ. Zwingli asserted that it was only a memorial. They failed to resolve their differences over this issue, and the conference adjourned without reaching an overall agreement between the Lutherans and the Zwinglians. The failure of the Marburg Colloquy was troubling for Hesse and Luther, but devastating to Zwingli, who desperately needed allies. In October 1531, war broke out between Protestant and Catholic provinces of Switzerland. Zwingli himself fought in the battles, in which he became known as the crusading priest. His army was defeated at the Second Battle of Kappel, and he was wounded and captured. Opposing troops killed Zwingli, cut his body into pieces, burned them, and scattered his ashes. Switzerland was left a country of two religions, civil war. John Calvin, a native of France, did not begin his academic training until 1523. After having a conversion experience that pushed him in the direction of a Reformation, he left France, a predominantly Catholic country, fearing persecution. He ended up in Geneva, Switzerland, where he made a name for himself as a reformer. In 1536, he wrote Institutes of the Christian Religion, a synthesis of his religious concepts. His own little 95 thesis, his argument. He eventually established a ministry in Geneva and hoped that one day create a theocracy based on his ideas, a religious society. So, what are his theological ideas? Calvin was convinced a person could never truly know if they were saved. Consequently, he believed each individual had to lead a deeply devoted and spiritual life to keep focused on the possibility of salvation in the afterlife. Calvin's theology focused on the issue of predestination and the elect. He believed that God had already chosen who would be allowed in heaven, the elected, and who would not. This was predestination. It's already decided. Because a person could not be certain if they were part of the elect, every person had to diligently maintain a pious life. Better safe than sorry. Free will was not a factor in his thinking. No free will, it's already decided. You can't affect it. Because it would detract from the sovereignty of God. God has a plan, you can't affect God's plan. Calvin taught that there was value in hard work. This is a principle that Max Weber, in his book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, argued was the spark to modern capitalism. Calvin believed in consubstantiation, that the elements of communion assumed mystical properties. He favored collective communal discipline, exercised either privately or publicly if necessary. So he's more on Luther's side about communion than he was with Zwingli. But if you think John Calvin, think predestination. You can remember that by remembering tulip. T, total depravity. Humans are sinful and cannot save themselves. U, unconditional election. People are chosen for salvation, but not because of anything they have done. Whether one gets saved depends solely on God's will. L, limited atonement. Only some are chosen to go to heaven, the elect. I, irresistible grace. Members of the elect, those who go to heaven, will not be able to resist the call of God. P, perseverance of the saints. An afterlife exists for the elect, those chosen, and once they have received grace, they cannot lose it. Once chosen, always chosen. Predestination. Calvin convinced the city council in Geneva to implement the ideas that were contained within his ecclesiastical orders. He created a special administrative body known as the consistory to implement and monitor the morality of the citizens of Geneva. It's a religious society with religious laws. The consistory had the authority to pass ordinances, laws, as well as punish those who violated those laws or who led immoral or undisciplined lives. Calvin's moral code covered behaviors that the city expected from its citizens. The consul could hand out discipline and punishment as it saw necessary. So your behavior is legislated. They decide how you're going to act, what you should do, how to live the Calvin style Christianity. So, as long as there's a Bible in the room, the cafe can be on. There's no card playing, no song singing, no bars allowed, no fortune telling, no cheating your customers. You can't dance, you can't drink, no playing. Plays are like their big form of entertainment. Think of like going to the movies. They would perform the movie in front of you. That's illegal now. You can't praise the Pope. We're very anti-Catholic. So it's not just that you need to be Christian. You have to be our type of Christian. John Calvin's Christian. Geneva became known as the Protestant Rome, as reformists from all over Europe flocked to the city for training and education. They then took the principles and ideas they'd learned back to their homelands, helping spread Calvinism across the continent. Significant Calvinist communities soon arose in France, where he was from, the Netherlands, and Scotland. French Calvinists, known as Huguenots, suffered severe persecution under King Henry II, a Catholic. France is a very Catholic place. To be Protestant or a Huguenot was dangerous. Calvinism soon became the dominant faith in the Netherlands, which lay under the nominal control of King Philip of Spain, who was also a Catholic. This would eventually lead to problems. Anabaptists. Let's talk about Anabaptists. Anabaptists rejected infant baptism because they felt that the ritual should be reserved for those old enough to make their own decisions about religion. In addition, because the movement stressed that all believers were equal, it focused less on material wealth. a fact which made Anabaptism attractive to members of the lower classes. Since both Protestants and Catholics retained the practice of infant baptism, the Anabaptists were persecuted by both groups. At the Diet of Speyer, Charles V of Germany made Anabaptism punishable by death. Michael Statler, an Anabaptist who belonged to the Swiss Brethren of Zurich, composed a document known as the Sleethlim Articles, which provided the first formal confession of faith for Anabaptists. Their own little thesis, their argument. Statler was later tried for heresy, convicted, and burned at the stake. What were these beliefs? Anabaptists saw the church as a voluntary community of the faithful. People could not be born into the church, nor could they belong to it simply because of their family or community positions. Anabaptists also believed that government should not play any role in religion, nor did it have any authority over true Christians. So, a separation of church and state. Their position on the relationship between church and state differed radically from that of other Protestant groups. Think back just recently to the Zurich under Zwingli, who was a total combination of church and state, and the laws were all about how to act more Christian. The Anabaptists reject that. They want a separation. Rather than linking the politics of the religion to the community, the Anabaptists called for a separation of the two. Anabaptists advocated a strict moral code and stressed humility. Swearing, alcohol, and outward displays of emotion were all discouraged. One of the earliest Anabaptist groups was the Swiss Brethren in Zurich. However, Zwingli expelled the group from the city because he viewed it as a threat. Several very radical Anabaptist groups came to the city of Munster in Germany because of its toleration, viewing it as a New Jerusalem. They managed to gain control of the city by force, expelled all unbelievers, and made all things communal, including spouses. The Radicals' leader, John Leyden, sometimes spelled Leydn, Leyden, proclaimed himself ruler of the Kingdom of Munster. He based his government on the doctrine of justification by faith, arguing that people should be allowed to live according to their consciences rather than any earthly law. He still brutally enforced religious doctrine, however, executing several transgressors. Consequently, Munster became both anarchical, no government, no laws, and repressive during his 18-month reign. Finally, a joint Protestant and Catholic army laid siege to the city, captured it, and executed the leaders of the Anabaptists. Mennonites. After the Munster incident, many Anabaptists felt they need to separate themselves from the outside world so that they could focus on more strongly on spiritual matters. Menno Simons, a popular Anabaptist leader in the Netherlands, led a branch of Anabaptism dedicated to pacifism. In doing so, he kept the Anabaptist movement alive in the Low Countries. After the Munster incident, Simons' Anabaptist branch became known as the Mennonites and spread throughout Europe and even to North America. We've talked about the splintering of the Protestants. The Protestants didn't always get along with other Protestants. Um, these are your discussion questions. But we see this splintering of Protestantism still continues today with even more denominations than ever.